Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WAPPP Research Seminar, which is focusing on fairness and meritocracy at work this spring. My name is Iris Bonnet, and I'm on the faculty here at the Kennedy School, and I serve as co-director of the Women in Public Policy program. Today, I am super excited to welcome Professor Lise Vesterlund, who is going to be presenting on gendered work, onset, and consequences. Lise is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh and Director of the Behavioral Economics Design Initiative and the Pittsburgh Experimental Economics Laboratory. She's also a former WAPPP Fellow, about which we are very proud. Lise is the co-author of an amazing book that I highly recommend to all of you, and that is entitled The No Club. And I'm not going to spill the beans because her work today is going to be related, in fact, to that book. And I should also let you know that Lise, as I just mentioned, doesn't only direct an experimental econs lab, but she does do experiments, including with organizations. And I know we always have amazing leaders in practice in the audience. So if you're interested in exploring this further, send me an email, send Lise an email directly. Happy to have that conversation, happy to connect you. Lise will be presenting some of her most recent research on this question of gendered work. And she will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. As always, please put your questions into the Q&A function, and I will read them to Lise. If you have questions during the talk that are clarifying, very happy to raise them before the end. But if your questions are bigger in nature, maybe we should best wait until the very end. And with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Lise. We're very excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Iris. I'm so pleased to be here. I had the pleasure of being a WAPPP Fellow in the fall, and it was just an amazing experience to be surrounded by a group of super scholars who are all working on the things that I care deeply about. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a larger research agenda that I've been working on for the past almost 15 years. And I'll sort of start off by laying out the groundwork for how we've been thinking about this, and then talk about some of the new research that we've been doing. So I've been looking at gender differences in the labor market for a long time. And as I said, for the past several years, I've started thinking more about not so much what people are getting paid and their promotions, but rather what really is driving those differences. And I think an important lens to look at that through is the task assignments that our employees are getting every single day. In particular, I've found that it sheds a lot of light on sort of gender differences in labor market outcomes to think about the task assignments in the sense of the extent to which they're promotable and not, where promotability is thought of as the extent to which your performance evaluation, your advancement will be affected by how well you do on the tasks. So there are some tasks that are high in promotability and sometimes tasks that are low in promotability. These tasks that are low in promotability, we have coined as non-promotable tasks, or NPTs. So tasks that help your organization, but really don't help improve your career. And it's really this set of sort of NPTs, non-promotable tasks, that I'm going to be talking a lot about today. You might say, well, what are these NPTs, or non-promotable tasks? Well, it depends, of course, on the job that you have, the rank you have, the experience you have, but common examples of NPTs are administrative work, mentoring, training, onboarding, serving on committees, resolving conflicts, doing office housework. So it's all the tasks that are really important within an organization, but yet when you do them, it's rare that you get much more than a thanks or a pat on the back for doing a good job and being a good champ. So those are some of the examples of non-promotable tasks. The characteristics that we usually use to think about non-promotable tasks are that they tend to be tasks that are not instrumental to the organization's objectives. So if you're working in a for-profit firm, billable hours would be promotable. Doing administrative work, pro bono work will tend to be non-promotable. It tends to be work that is less visible. So you may be putting the slide deck together, but if you're not giving the presentation, you will be given less credit for that work. And it tends to be work that, to a smaller extent than promotable work, does not require specialized skills. Meaning, if you're not doing the work, someone else could be doing the work. So that's a set of tasks that I and my co-authors have been spending a lot of time thinking about. In particular, in the book that Iris mentioned, our book joint with Linda Babcock, Brenda Peiser, and Lori Weingard, really tried to zero in on these non-promotable tasks, and in particular look at who is it who's doing these non-promotable tasks. And what we found in the book, so we talk both about who's doing the work, but also what are the solutions to these differences in work assignments. But what we found very systematically in the book was that when we look at different organizations, in fact, one of the ones that we looked at was a professional services firm. And within a professional services firm, the advantage of those firms is that they keep very careful track of the hours that their employees are spending and the tasks that they're spending them on. So we got data from a professional services firm, and we could look at all the different tasks that their employees had done. And then we could sit down with management and say, to what extent is this work promotable and non-promotable? And what we found in this professional services firm, so I think pretty much any organization I've worked with will agree that women probably are doing more of the office housework. If it comes to cleaning up the kitchen, women are probably doing more of that work. The challenge is to sort of assess how many hours we're talking about. And what was disturbing in this particular firm was that women in this organization, sort of mid-career women, this is something that we saw at every level, but mid-career women were spending 200 more hours on non-promotable work per year than their male colleagues. So that is a full month of work that they were spending on non-promotable tasks, in addition to what the men were doing. So we're not talking a few hours and a few minutes per week. We're talking about a very sizable difference in work assignments. Men at this mid-career level were instead spending those hours on promotable tasks. So as you can imagine, you come up for promotion if you have 200 fewer hours of the work that the organization cares most about, is going to be challenging to advance. So this is what we found in professional services firms. It turns out that there are lots of studies in this space, and we have yet to find a study where we do not get this gap. So as I said, for professional services firms, we find it consistently. If we look at women in academia, we get the same pattern with women more than men spending time on committees. Among attorneys, female attorneys are spending more time on pro bono work. It shows up among supermarket clerks, where women more than men are positioned at the checkout line, which means they don't get the experience that is needed to get promoted to manager. It shows up for engineers, where similarly women are given more administrative work instead of the engineering tasks that they're trained for. It shows up for TSA agents. It shows up for architects. We have yet to find an occupation where these differences don't show up. Now, you could say, well, to what extent should we be concerned about this? Well, the extent to which we should be concerned about it really depends on why women are ending up with this work. So in our early studies, we really wanted to understand what are the drivers that make women do more of these tasks? Is it because they're better at the task? Is it because they like doing them more? What is it that put women in this position where they're taking on more of this work? So some of the study that we published in the American Economic Review, together with the team that I mentioned before, and also Maria Ricalde, really wanted to try to understand why women are doing more of these non-promotable tasks. And in particular, what we realized when we reflected on our own work, we were realizing that some of the tasks that we had taken on, we had actually volunteered for. In fact, we pretty much all know the feeling of being in a meeting where there's that uncomfortable request for who's going to volunteer for a task that nobody wants to take on. And we know how it goes down. A manager comes in, asks for a volunteer, and once the request has been made, everybody gets busy looking at their watches, checking for mails, doing all kinds of other things rather than reluctantly raising their hand. And we wanted to study who is it who raises their hand to take on a task that obviously is important since the manager is asking for it. Who is it who raises their hand in that scenario? And to try to study that, we studied it in many different ways, but one of the sort of very informative studies we did was one where we conducted a controlled experiment where we brought people into my lab at the University of Pittsburgh, and we paired them up in groups of three. And then we told them, you have 2 minutes to decide whether or not you want to click a button, meaning raise your hand to take on this task that nobody wants to take on, but that everybody would benefit from. And then we told them that the pay you're going to get is you're going to get $1 if nobody clicks the button. But if you click the button, you're going to get $1.25, and the two other members of your group will get $2. So everybody is going to be better off if somebody volunteers. It's just you would much rather have somebody else volunteer than yourself. So it's very similar to when we're in a scenario where we're looking for a volunteer in an organization. We wish that somebody would just volunteer, but we know we're going to raise our hand to take on the holiday party if nobody else is going to do it. So they do this 10 times. There are new rounds, new teams every single round, always with 3 people. And they're men and women in the lab, approximately 50-50 males and females. And what we see in that scenario, as I said, they do it 10 times. So if there are 3 people in the group, we would expect people to volunteer. If we always got a volunteer, 3 1/3 time out of the 10 that they have available. So let's see how often they volunteer. How often does the individuals volunteer? And if we look at men and women, we can see that indeed women volunteer on average 3 1/3 time, but they volunteer about 50% more than men in these groups. So in every single round, we see men volunteering less than women. Now, similar to what we see in terms of the non-promotable work, we could say, well, why is this happening? Is it because women somehow are better at volunteering? Well, the advantage of being in the lab is that we can say, well, the task here is clicking a button. And I can assure you that men and women are equally good at clicking buttons. So it's not a question of skill. But it could be because men and women somehow have different preferences. It could be because women potentially are more altruistic or more risk averse and therefore decide to volunteer more. So we ran another study to try to see, is this just coming from women somehow having different preferences? Are they more concerned about the teams that they're in? So the way we ran the study was that we went back to saying, okay, we had run a study with men and women. If women somehow have different preferences, we should be able to compare all male teams to all female teams. And if all female teams indeed are more altruistic, then we should see the all female teams volunteer more than the all male teams. So just as a reminder, what we saw in the mixed gender setting was that women volunteered about 50% more than men. Now let's think about what's going to happen if I remove the women from the group. So if you look at the male group in the mixed sex sessions, and we try to remove the females from that group, what we'll see is that indeed men do know how to volunteer. It's just that they don't volunteer when the women are in the groups. So the minute I move into single sex, where there's only women and only men, we see men and women volunteering at exactly the same rate. What that tells us is that this is not coming from preferences. Rather, what it's coming from is the collective belief that we have that when we're in a mixed sex session, women are the ones who should be volunteering. So once we have those beliefs, and once women have those beliefs and men have those beliefs, it becomes in the interest of women to volunteer because nobody else is going to step up to the task. But as you can see, if I go back to looking at the mixed sex session, women, the minute I remove the men, can lean back and rely on the other women to take on the task. So we find this clear evidence that this is not coming just from skill or just from preferences, but rather from the expectation that women are taking this on. We see that in another study as well, where instead we say, well, sometimes you don't get to really volunteer for a task. Rather, you're being voluntold. Somebody tells you, could you please step up to the task? We ran an experiment where instead there was a manager who gets to ask, he gets to see the three people in their group and gets to send a message saying, hey, could you please be the one to click the button? What we see in that scenario is consistent with the expectation that women are seen as more likely to volunteer, that indeed women are asked 44% more often than men. And interestingly, they're asked 44% more than men, both by male and female managers. There's no difference. Men and women ask women more at exactly the same rate. Now, of course, we could say, well, is it a good idea to ask these women if they've been asked over and over? And indeed, it is a very good idea to ask women because they say yes 50% more than men. So what this initial research that we did sort of very clearly point to is that women volunteer more, I ask more and say yes more because we expect them to. So it's not a question of skill, it's not a question of preferences. There's an underlying expectation that women take on these work assignments. Now, why is it important that we identify expectations? It's important because number one, this points out that women can't simply say no to these tasks. If they're faced with different expectations, they will face backlash when they say no. So it's not simply that women need to learn how to say no because they're in a different environment than their male colleagues, where men instead are rewarded for saying yes to tasks. So it makes it very challenging for women to fix it. And intriguingly, it also shows that organizations are making mistakes if they end up with these gendered task assignments, because we shouldn't allocate work based on expectations, but rather based on comparative advantage. So organizations really should be interested in trying to fix this problem. So that's sort of where we ended the book. We said it's up to organizations. We left suggestions and clear directions for how they could improve things. But what was sort of left after this work were a couple of really important questions. Number one, we were saying that these tasks were non-promotable, but we didn't have clear evidence of it. So what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk is the evidence that we've found on what is the impact of getting different work assignments, and very importantly, how quickly do these differences show up? Because if they show up really, really early, if they show up within the first year of you arriving at the labor market, we should be very concerned about the consequences of these work assignments. So one of the things that we have done in trying to understand the impact and consequences of work assignments is to once again go back into our laboratory. And this is joint work with Marissa Leppa and Maria Ricalde, both former students of mine. And what we did to try to understand sort of the impact of getting different work assignments is to say, what happens if we randomly assign a task? So we first run a work experiment where workers are asked to complete tasks, a promotable and a non-promotable task, and then they're paid by a supervisor. And then afterwards, we have evaluators come in, look at what these workers did, and both assess how good they are and make a promotion decision. And to try to sort of potentially fix it, we also have an intervention where we try to give people more information about how productive these workers were so that they can make the right decision. So if we can't sort of equalize work assignments, could we possibly give people more information so that they get better at assessing them? So just to give you sort of a rough overview of what the overall experiment is, we first have this work experiment where we have a supervisor, we have a green worker and a blue worker, that's what we call them. But basically it just means that you have different task assignments, in particular to sort of get at the promotability in tasks, to have both a task that's low in promotability and one that's high. We assign people tasks that vary in productivity. So one is a slider task, which is slower and harder than a key press task. So think about this as being sort of the task where it's easy to see productivity. The key press task where you have to just press a letter is about 3 to 4 times faster than the slider task. And then what we tell people is, so we take our participants and we give them random assignments to these tasks. So in particular, for 5 rounds, they're paired with a supervisor. And the green sort of disadvantaged worker, we tell them that they first have to solve 12 sliders. Think about this as being an excessive administrative load. They have to do a lot of administrative work before they can get to the task that is very productive. So they have to do 12 sliders before they get to the key press. And they do this for 2 minutes to generate revenue for the manager and to generate wage for themselves and the other worker. The blue advantaged worker, however, only has to solve 3 sliders before they get onto the key press. So think about this as being your administrative work. If you have a very large load of administrative work, it takes a long time before you get to the billable hours. That really is what we're paying attention to. So the way it's set up is that they perform these tasks for 2 minutes. They generate revenue to the manager. In particular, they are going to, for each task that they solve, whether or not it's a key press or the slider task, they get 5 cents that potentially can be split between the two of them. And then the supervisor also gets paid. So the supervisor just wants to generate as much revenue. The supervisor sees how much they've produced and then decides how to split the joint worker earnings between the two of them. So they do this for 5 rounds. And then to sort of get a sense of how good they are at these tasks, at the very end, we have each of the workers perform the task for 1 minute so that we can see how good they really are. What we're really interested, though, in is how these workers are being evaluated. So we have this evaluator experiment where an evaluator sees what happened among these workers for the 5 rounds, and then they make a promotion decision. Who's going to be just on the fast productive task? Who's going to be doing solely sort of the equivalent of billable hours, and who's going to solely be doing administrative work? And then they evaluate how good the workers are. So to be more precise, the promotion decision that they have is just to decide which worker do you want on the sort of the slow task, who do you want on the fast task? So do you want the green disadvantaged worker to only be on the slider task and the advantaged worker to only be on the key press, or do you want the reverse? So you make a decision, which worker do you want to specialize in which task? And then you also make a sort of performance evaluation decision where you say, how good was my worker at this task? So let me show you some results that I think really points out the dynamics and why why gendered work assignments is such a challenging problem. So what we see in results, as I said, we have the blue advantaged worker getting the easier task, and not surprisingly, they end up producing more of the revenue. So they end up producing about 60% of whatever pie is being produced in every round, whereas the disadvantaged worker only produces 40%. Now, what does that mean in terms of the pay that they get? They end up getting the advantaged worker. Remember, this is random assignment to the task. There's nothing special about you. You've just been assigned a task. The worker who gets the easier task assignment, the more productive task assignment, ends up getting paid about 55% of the overall pie, meaning that they get a pay advantage that's about 20 to 25% relative to the other workers, simply because they've been given a different task. So those are the pays that we get. Now, what is interesting about getting these different task assignments is that even though the workers initially are equally good at these tasks, remember, they've never done these tasks before, what happens once you get the task is that you actually get better at it. So if we look at how good these workers are, we can first look at how good they are at the slider task. On the left, I have how good the disadvantaged worker is at the slider task. And we can see that on average, they end up being about at the 60th percentile in terms of the performance. So once you get more of the non-promotable tasks, once you get the holiday party, you actually become good at the holiday party. So we can see that the advantaged worker is about at the 40th percentile, the disadvantaged worker is about at the 60th percentile. So simply because you got more of the task, you get better at it. What about when we look at the key press, sort of the promotable task? We get a similar result, not quite as extreme, but indeed the blue worker who was getting the easier task ends up being better at the promotable task. So the work assignments in and of themselves gives you an advantage because you get experience at the task and you get better at the task. So we have to be really careful about who gets what assignment to start out with, because once you've been given more of an assignment, you develop skills in that assignment. And that's why we need to think about, do we want to make sure that people get the same assignment so I can figure out what tasks are they actually good at? So this is the performance ranking. So we can see just from getting the work assignments, you develop different skills. Now, the reason why we ran the evaluator experiment was that we wanted to see, okay, now I'm going to see these performances. How good are you going to be assessed as being on these tasks? So we're going to ask the evaluators to rank how good these individual workers are at the task. And what we will see for the evaluation is the following. If we first look at sort of the disadvantaged worker, so we can see the disadvantaged worker, the solid square is what their actual performance is. And we can see that the evaluation of the disadvantaged is pretty accurate on the slider task, and it's, fairly accurate on the letter pairs. So I look at my disadvantaged worker, and I'm pretty good at assessing how they are relative to the overall population. Now, the advantaged worker, remember, they got to spend more task on the fast task, right? So they had more time on the task that I really cared about that's going to generate lots of revenue. How do I evaluate that worker? Again, the solid square is showing me what the actual ranking is. And I'm now going to show you what the manager believes about their actual performance. And what we can see is that when I evaluate the advantaged worker, I'm seeing all the revenue that they're bringing in. What I'm going to say is, I think this worker is amazing, right? So it's as if I've given one worker a chainsaw and the other worker a manual saw. And when I see all the wood that's being chopped down by my advantaged worker, I have an exaggerated view about how incredible they are. So it's true that there's a slight comparative advantage just from giving the task, but my assessment of these workers is that on the task that I care most about, the billable work, I think that they are off the chart in terms of how good they are. Their actual performance is like at the 55th percentile. I assess them to be at the 72nd percentile on average. Not only do I think that they're amazing on the letter pairs, I also think that they're amazing at the non-promotable task. So it's not just that I think they're incredible on my billable hours. I also think that they're amazing on the holiday party. They're amazing and off the chart and everything. So that's the evaluation. Now, if you think about getting different work assignments, I'm going to give amazing performance reviews to someone simply because I gave them a better task. Now, when it comes time to performance, to deciding who I'm going to promote, who am I going to put full time on the task where they're most productive at? And remember, even though I'm showing averages here, the distributions there, sometimes when the disadvantaged worker actually is the worker who's better at solving the letter pairs. And the question is, can I figure that out as the manager? And what we see for the promotion decision is that when I'm making my choice over the promotions, what I should be doing, and again, I'm just going to show averages, what I should be doing, just because the advantaged worker has had more time on this task, is that I should be giving the advantaged worker the task 65% of the time. How often do I actually give them assign them only to the fast task, the key press? I assign them to the task 73% of the time. So it's not just a comparative advantage. I have this exaggerated view of how good my advantaged worker is who got the better task that makes me give them the promotion far more often than what I actually should. So this is clearly a problem from the organizational perspective. So we could imagine, well, what if we gave more information about how fast you are per minute so that I clearly could compare my two workers. So we run an information treatment to say, I'm going to give you much more information about how good these workers are so that you can make the right performance evaluation and make the right promotion decisions. And I was actually working with an organization where I was hopeful that precisely this intervention was going to help us fix the problem, because it's clear that we're promoting the wrong people and we're giving those exact same advantaged people an excessive performance evaluation. So I thought maybe if we had this information intervention, what happens with the information intervention, which gives detailed information on how good these workers are, we see that indeed I get a little bit better. I sort of correct my excessive assessment of the advantaged worker on the sliders. So I don't have this exaggerated view of how good they are on the sliders. But what about the task that I really care about? The task I really care about, the one that's generating lots of revenue for me, the billable hour equivalent task on the letter pairs, lo and behold, I continue to think that the advantaged worker, even when I have really detailed information about how fast they are, I continue to think that this worker is amazing. So what about the promotion decision? Indeed, I continue to over-promote the advantaged worker. This is a very, very hard problem to fix. Once I have this exaggerated view, I continue to think that my advantaged worker, the worker who got the easy assignment, is a superstar. Now, we could sort of imagine, what if we looked at the workers? Remember, the workers, they know that they had the chainsaw. They know that they had the advantage over everybody else. So what if we just looked at the workers? Will they understand this? So will we promote people who understood where they came from and then fix the problem? So if we look at the workers, they also assess how good they are. And we can see, so you see here on the right, that their actual ranking, and the left, the belief that they have on where they rank. And we can see by and large, they're fairly good at assessing their performance on the slider task. What about the task that the organization really cares about? Lo and behold, the worker who had the advantage, who got the easy task, also believes that they are superstars on this task. So you can see how problematic this is, because once you give different task assignments, we develop different abilities, and we end up having these exaggerated views about how good we ourselves are, because we don't take into account that our increased productivity is coming from the task that we have, the advantage we have in the work assignment, rather than our true ability. So the experiment sort of demonstrates how challenging this is. And I want to finish off in the last 10 minutes to talk a little bit about what it is that we're seeing from field data on these work assignments. What evidence do we have of how quickly these differences in work assignments show up? If it is truly driven by beliefs, we would expect them to show up very quickly. So I'm going to talk both about evidence of sort of early onset, how quickly does this happen, but also talk about what is the evidence we have from the field. This was from an experiment where it sort of demonstrates how gendered work can affect your performance evaluation and advancement. But what do we know from the field about these differences? So I've been doing, for the past 6 years, a study with MBAs in Norway, of all places. This is the second most gender equal society in the world. So it would be interesting to see if we get gender differences in work assignments there before. Everything I've done until this point has always been in the US. But this is sort of going to push the boundary, and an advantage of being in Norway is that we have lots of administrative and registered data on these exact same people. So we can very precisely say, if I have almost identical men and women who go into the labor market, what happens to their careers. So we have surveyed them while they're in business school, and then for several years after they enter the labor market, to see what happens to their work assignments in the field. And then in addition, we have been working with a very large international professional services firm that actually hired these same workers to see what their data suggests. So remember, we're in very gender equal society. I'm just going to give you a snapshot of what we're seeing in this otherwise very large study. And what we're seeing in terms of first onset, when do we get these differences in work assignments? One of the things that we ask in the survey is just a standard survey question that actually shows up in the register of data as well, where we just ask them to say, how much time do you spend on project work, consulting, training others, customer service, etc. So there's a whole list of tasks, and they just report how much time they spent on them, or to the extent to which they're working on these tasks. We have lots of controls of industry they're in, how many employees it is, what city is it in. And then we have managers. We have about 200 managers who look at the task and then rate them by promotability. So is it highly promotable? Is it non-promotable? And we just classify what is a total of 12 tasks into promotable and non-promotable. And what I'm going to show you are the results from year one. So they have just graduated from the best business school in Norway. They've just entered the labor market. We have control for all the other characteristics that they have. And what we're seeing is in year one of these otherwise identical employees going on the market, men, the coefficient here is going to show the extent to which men are more than women reporting that they are spending time on promotable tasks or non-promotable. And you can see in year one, we are seeing differences in work assignments. Men more than women are spending time on promotable tasks. If I go on and I look at year two, we are beginning to see differences in non-promotable tasks as well. We can also go on to sort of another question that gets at this in a different way, where we more directly ask them whether or not they're doing promotable and non-promotable tasks. So now we say, compared to your peers, how much time do you spend on work that can lead to promotions as being sort of our promotable assessment? We also say, relative to your peers, I more often carry out administrative tasks, finding a time for everyone to meet, taking notes at a meeting, planning office parties, etc. So a clear measure of non-promotable tasks. And remember, these are all MBAs that we're looking at. What do we get for this survey measure? Again, we get very clear evidence of early onset of gendered work. Men more than women report spending time on promotable tasks. Women more than men report spending time on administrative tasks. This is in year one after graduation. What about year two after graduation? If anything, the gap is even bigger. So we're finding this in second most gender equal society in the world. Clear evidence of early onset of gender task. Now, another question, of course, is, well, does this matter? Does it actually affect your career that you're given different work assignments? So then we can ask them, we have your year one work assignments. Does it affect whether or not you experience any kind of promotion by year two? And what we see in that case is the following, and I should say this is controlling for preferences, demographics, family plans, everything. These differences in work assignments are not driven by any individual characteristic. What is driving it is gender. It's a pattern that is most prevalent in large organizations and male-dominated organizations, but it is something that shows up in all organizations. So that's what we see in terms of the task assignments, but what about impact on their promotion? So does the work assignment you have in year one affect your promotion in year two? So regrettably, it does. So looking at whether or not you get more time on promotable work, if you get more time on promotable work, you're more likely to have experienced some kind of promotion by year two. And remember, we ask you in year one, we come back in year two. This is not elicited at the same time. What about spending time on administrative work? This is also an assignment that you've been given. Doing administrative work has no impact on your promotion. So if you are going to figure out how you're going to spend your time, if you have any decision power over how you're spending your time, spending it on promotable work is going to lead to promotion. So that's what we have from the MBA study. Now, as I said, we also worked with a professional services firm that sort of hires all these workers. This is a firm that is very concerned about gender equality. We met with them. They were convinced that they did not have this problem. Let's look at the data. We got time use data from them from 2020 to 2025. And here's what we see. This is differences in billable hours. And you can see in every one of the years, from year one and until through year 6, in every year, women have fewer billable hours than their male colleagues. You could say, well, what are women doing? What they're doing is that they're spending time on what they call local roles. So what we're seeing instead, very systematically from year one, women are spending many more hours on local roles and tasks than their male colleagues. Now, of course, there are some differences in where you're assigned. There are differences in the number of hours that you work. So we can run regressions to see what if I control for all those differences. And if I control for all those differences, it turns out in year one of these workers being hired in the firm, same firm, working in the same sections, men and women who are spending the exact same hours at work women are spending 45 fewer hours per year on billable hours. So this is men and women working same number of hours. Women spend fewer hours on billables. What are they doing instead? Well, lo and behold, they're spending those on local roles. So it's not that women are working less. These are men and women who are spending the same number of hours, and they're very different, large differences in work assignments. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip this next result, because what is particularly interesting here is that these work assignments matter for the work assignments that you have 4 years later. So those early differences are predictive of the workloads that you have later, both in billable hours and in local roles. What about promotion? Does it matter what work assignment you had in year one for your promotion 4 years later? And very regrettably, it does. So if you are given more of these local roles early on, it's going to decrease the likelihood that you are promoted by year 4. So those early work assignments have a very large impact on your subsequent performance evaluation. So I hope what I've convinced you of is that these gender differences in work assignments are very prevalent. We're talking about a lot of hours. It shows up very early. It affects your performance evaluation. It affects your pay. It affects your advancement. And it is costly, not just to women, but also to the organizations that hire them, because they end up promoting not workers who necessarily are best at the task, but rather those who are less empowered to decline requests for these non-promotable tasks. So I'm going to stop there so we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this incredible and also depressing presentation. But we might have some amazing people in the audience who can come up with some ideas of how to overcome this dynamic. But before we get there, we have an important question by Mitra. Obviously some of your work was based in the lab where everyone was anonymous. So it wasn't social expectations that women were trying to meet. But Mitra asks this important question. So a potential solution is tell women to stop volunteering. But this risks dislikability. Does that have a bigger negative impact than doing a higher proportion of NPTs?
I think I definitely agree. The challenge in demonstrating that expectations are driving part of this really make it clear how difficult it is for women to decline these tasks. There's this beautiful study by Heilman and Chen where they look at how we respond to men and women who decline requests for tasks. And what it shows is that if women say they sort of have three different scenarios, one where there's a request to do a task and an employee says yes, one where there's a request to do a task and the employee says no, and one where there's no request at all. Women who say yes are seen as equivalent in desirability to women who were never asked. So saying yes is already expected. You're not going to get any bonus point for saying yes. If you say no, however, you're seen as worse as somebody who was never asked. So there's negative backlash on women who say no. By contrast, men who say no are seen as equivalent to men who were never asked. So men get a bonus for saying yes, no penalty for saying no. So this expectation really makes it very challenging for women to turn down these requests. It's not just a question of you as a junior woman saying, no, that's a non-promotable task. I don't want to do that, because the response is going to be very negative once there is an expectation that you're going to say yes.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, on the upside, Lisa, I think at least you're giving us some language to at least, I'm not trying to convince our audience to just go out there and say, I'm never going to do a non-promotable task again, but at least you're helping us put our experiences into perspective. So hopefully that might at least be useful for us kind of going forward. But I don't want to monopolize. I have more questions
No, and
here,
I really appreciate that comment, Iris, because that is actually one of when we wrote the book, we were asked, what is your objective in writing the book? And a clear objective in writing the book was to give a vocabulary so that we know what it is. Like, so there's a statement, if you can name it, you can tame it. If we don't call it non-promotable tasks, it's very hard to address the problem. So at least getting the vocabulary, so that what I saw in a lot of the interviews with young women who have just entered the labor market is that they get tricked into doing these tasks. I spoke to a woman in mergers and acquisition who was told that it would be great for her career if she could recruit interns for the firm. Now, of course, if you're in mergers and acquisitions, you should be doing mergers and acquisition. But if you're told this is good for your career, then suddenly, it's much harder to figure out. So at a minimum, just talking about these non-promotable tasks and bringing awareness to them is going to empower women. So at least they don't get tricked and find out 2 years later down the road, wait a minute, why is everybody moving ahead? I'm working as many hours, but I'm not getting anywhere.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. So the next question is about parenthood. I don't know whether that's something you have studied, but the question is, does it get worse, or how can we say anything about parental status?
So one of the interesting things, certainly early on, and part of the reason why we wanted to follow people was precisely to see what happens over your life trajectory, because we know so many things happen once you have children. We don't have enough data to talk to that right now. What we can see is that individuals who are planning to have children earlier do not experience this. It's not as if they're leaning out of the labor market. If anything, those who are expecting to have children earlier have less of a problem. So it's not that you're leaning out and don't want this. Remember, so this cohort, they're all about 24 years old when we start having them in the sample. They don't have children. They are hungry and ready to fight for their careers. So we don't have the parental obligations yet, but we were thinking that there might have been a difference in terms of when you were expecting to have children. But if anything, those who are expecting to have children have less of these non-promotable tasks.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question about kind of potential mechanisms. And then a number of people actually already have potential ideas for solutions. So we'll want to spend the remainder of our time on solutions. So Beth asks the role of AI. That's, of course, $1 million question that everyone is interested in these days. Is it going to help? Because presumably, as she writes, women can complete admin tasks at a differentiated rate, and whether that would then continue to reinforce that women continue to be asked, for the lower level tasks, as in now they're even faster, versus seen as efficient and ready to take on more. And I presume maybe she means with more promotable work. A good question. Hard to know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about AI and gender differences in connection with non-promotable tasks, I think is harder to figure out where things are going to be moving faster. Um, we've always seen differences in technology adoption among men and women. What is scary about AI is how quickly it's moving and how we're seeing fewer women getting on that train at the same speed as men. So if anything, I would be more concerned about AI helping on the promotable task and giving even more of a comparative advantage to those who get a shot at it early on. Because once you get the AI amplification, that difference coming from early assignment is going to seem even larger. But I just don't know at this stage.
No, thank you. So now I'm going to move to some ideas for solutions. So a first one is basically just making it visible. Would it help kind of to inform people of the gaps and kind of basic help decision makers make smarter choices? And then a second one related goes one step further, and actually two people, Allison and Beth, make this comment. Make them rewardable, basically. Part of performance reviews, KPIs, objectives, anything you have on that front.
So certainly making differences visible is key. If we can only correct the things that we measure. Like that's one of your points in all the work that you have done to Iris. If we don't measure differences in work assignments, we're never going to be able to affect how we distribute work. So visibility is central, being brave enough in organizations to try to document what the work distribution is something that we encourage all the time. So awareness documentation is key to fixing the problem. It's very tempting to say, why don't we just make non-promotable tasks promotable? And the challenge in doing that is that it's a task that doesn't require specialized skills to the same extent as promotable tasks. So the employees we tend to hire are those who are really good at the promotable work. So getting external offers, getting rewarded by the market will tend to focus on the promotable work. So while we can have expectations for how much non-promotable she should be doing, I think there's limited room to bring it up to the level of promotable task. And as a result, if there's going to be some work that is more promotable than others, it will always matter what the work distribution is. So there's certainly visibility, recognition, expectations, having clear expectations for how much employees should be doing of the non-promotable work. Not to say everybody should be doing the same, but among peers that we see as equivalent employees, we would want them to spend the same amount of time on non-promotables.
Thank you. We have another question which asks more about whether what you find, and you shared at the beginning lots of professions where you found this. And now the question is, maybe in more people-oriented professions where we value the type of you know a type of task that we've now learned is non-promotable. Is the penalty smaller? So people-oriented work such as marketing or HR roles.
Um, so it's hard to say where it matters more because we don't have the data yet. When I talk about the non-promotable task varying, it really is to look within each occupation and try to look within that occupation, what is the non-promotable task? So what is non-promotable is going to be different in HR than what it is in marketing. In marketing, certainly having billable hours, securing big clients is still going to be the promotable work. In HR, certainly more people-oriented tasks are going to be more promotable. But even within that, there's going to be some work that gets less recognition. So it's not as if we can say, all people-oriented tasks are non-promotable. looking at within each occupation and saying, I can assure you there's no job where organizing the holiday party or cleaning up the kitchen, filling the dishwasher is going to be seen as promotable. So the office housework everywhere is going to be non-promotable, but naturally there's going to be variation across different occupations. And in order to really say where this problem is larger or smaller, we need to clearly define what is non-promotable in each occupation.
Mhm. Thank you. We have two more questions, and then I'm going to have to wrap this up. But then Fernando has a question about the distribution. While you basically talked about averages, I think his question is more about what in the extremes. I think he was surprised that men experience so few penalties for not conforming to the expectations. But is there basically a limit? I mean, if they are very high, on non-conforming tasks, might there also be penalties for men?
So, while we call them non-promotable tasks, there's no doubt that if you do none, you will not get promoted, right? So everybody has to do it. Sorry, I'm getting an echo suddenly. So if you are a nasty colleague, nobody will want you to work there. The question is more, do we set a check mark at having done some non-promotable tasks? Or do we actually quantify how much non-promotable work that you've done? One of the things in distributions that is interesting from our experiment is if we have all women, they more or less share the non-promotable tasks equally. If we have all male groups, about 50% of the men volunteer once or never. And so if you're in an all-male group, there's sort of a super volunteering group of men that manage to make the groups look similar. So while we just talk about gender here, there's intersectionality, there are different characteristics of men and women. Who we ask depends on your appearance, etc. Do you look friendly? Do you not look friendly? So the distributional results are really interesting. I think the key is that while there are distributional differences, we're constantly looking at distributions that first order stochastically dominate one another. So while there's lots of heterogeneity, there really are separations in the distributions that we're seeing for men and women across the board. But not doing any non-promotable, everybody has to do some. It's just that people get away. There's a big difference in how much non-promotable work you can get away with.
Thank you. We're almost at time, but I'm going to merge these last two questions, and that is, when does it start? Does it start in school again? I don't know whether you've looked at this. And then this is a hard question. So what do we do? That's a question, more an individual question, right? This is now not an organization solution, where I think you and I are slightly more optimistic that organizations could be doing more. But that's the individual question. What do I do?
So very quickly on where does this start? So we don't know exactly where to start. What we can see from the MBAs is that even joint work projects that they have in business school, women more than men are made to do the non-promotable work. So women more than men gets the project started, checks for details, make sure that they upload. Men more than women stop working on the assignment when they think it's good enough and claim that they have done more work on the project. So we're seeing differences before they enter the labor market. So I think these gendered expectations show up very early in our lives. Now, what to do? We have lots of suggestions in the book. As you were saying, Iris, this is something that organizations should be concerned about. Making managers, holding them responsible for how work is distributed at a minimum in year one. If we have equally qualified men and women joining an organization, asking managers to keep track of how work is distributed in year one seems like an obvious point of starting. We are all concerned about billable hours. If we keep looking just at wage and promotion, we're going to always see differences in wages and promotions if we don't understand that there are differences in work assignments every single day. So I think an easy starting point is just to say, let's at least give people a shot at showing what they're good at. Because once you have different work assignments, that's what we're seeing in the experiment. Once you have different work assignments, it is really, really difficult to fix afterwards. So at least give employees an equal chance of showing what they're good at when they first come into an organization.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for this very important work that you have been leading and for leaving us with some ideas on what to do about the problem. So with that, unfortunately, the downside of the virtual seminar is that you can't hear us clap, but I'm going to clap for all of us. Thank you very much. This was a really wonderful seminar, and we all learned so much.
Thank you so
and
much.
with that, thank you not only to our speaker, but to all of you for joining us this week's seminar.